You know, there are some places in the world that just feel different. There's this field in the Scottish Highlands, right outside Inverness. It's often cold, windswept, and eerily quiet. But that quiet, it's heavy. It's the weight of a truly sorrowful story. This is Culloden Moor.
And it's not just a feeling, you know? Visitors, historians, even locals have said it for years. You can feel the echoes of the past right there under your feet. It's not just a historic site, it's like the place itself holds on to its memories, charged with the raw energy of what happened on one tragic afternoon back in 1746.
So that's the big question we're going to tackle. How could a single hour of fighting on this one patch of ground not only end a war, but also trigger the dismantling of an entire way of life? Because the Battle of Culloden wasn't just the last major battle on British soil. It was a brutal, bloody turning point that changed Scotland and really the world forever.
Okay, so let's dive in. But before we get into the nitty-gritty of the battle itself, I want to start with what this place is like today, because it's become a place of pilgrimage, a site of solemn remembrance, and incredibly, a landscape that is still giving up its secrets.
If you ever get the chance to go, you'll find it's run by the National Trust for Scotland, and they've done an incredible job. You can literally walk between the flags, marking the battle lines where the armies stood. You can see the huge memorial cairn and walk among the headstones, which mark the mass graves of the Highland clans. It is a profoundly moving and honestly a pretty heavy experience.
All right, so now that we know what the field is like today, let's rewind the clock. To really get what happened to Culloden, you have to understand this was no simple story of good guys and bad guys, or even Scotland versus England. The reality, well, it was a whole lot messier and way more tragic.
So, what was this all about? Well, it all boiled down to something called the Jacobite cause. The name Jacobite comes from Jacobus, which is just Latin for James. They wanted to kick out the sitting Hanoverian king, George II, and put the exiled Stuart family back on the throne. But this wasn't just a British squabble. You see, it was part of a much bigger European war, with France backing the Jacobites, mostly just to cause trouble for their old rivals, the British.
Now, this is maybe the single most important thing to get about Culloden. Forget what you've seen in movies. This was not Scotland versus England. It was a civil war, plain and simple. There were thousands of Scots fighting for the British government in Scottish regiments. Powerful Highland clans, like the Campbells, sided with the government too. It was Scot against Scot.
So let's look at the two sides squaring off. And right away, you can see this is a total mismatch. On one side, you've got the Jacobites led by Bonnie Prince Charlie. They're outnumbered, exhausted, and basically starving. On the other, you have the Duke of Cumberland's army, a well-fed, well-rested, and professional fighting machine. The odds were just stacked against the Jacobites from the get-go. You know, you could say the battle was lost before a single shot was even fired. Just look at the 24 hours leading up to it. It's a story of one bad decision after another. First, the Jacobites stand around all day with no food. Then, they're marched on a desperate, failed night attack that just completely drains them. They end up stumbling back to Culloden Moor, a wet, boggy piece of ground that was the absolute worst place for them to fight. They were beaten before they even started.
And so, the stage was set. What happened next wasn't really a battle, it was an hour of absolute slaughter. Everything, the leadership, the terrain, the condition of the men, it all came together to create a perfect storm of devastation. Okay, so the Highlanders had this legendary tactic, right? The Highland Charge. It was meant to be this terrifying, lightning-fast rush that would just smash through enemy lines. But at Culloden, the ground was a nightmare. It was wet, marshy, and it slowed their charge to a crawl, and that left them totally exposed to the government's cannons for what must have felt like an eternity.
And what were those cannons firing? Something called grape shot, and it is absolutely horrific. The best way to think about it is like turning a cannon into a giant shotgun. Instead of one big cannonball, it fired a canvas bag packed with metal balls that sprayed out in a wide cone. It didn't just kill people, it tore them to pieces. So for the few Jacobites who actually made it through that storm of cannon fire, they ran smack into a wall of redcoats. And Cumberland's army was ready. They had a plan. They fired in disciplined volleys, and they used a new, brutally effective bayonet drill. Instead of trying to stab the guy in front of you, you'd stab the exposed side of the Highlander attacking the soldier to your right. Once the charge was broken, it was over. The cavalry swept in, and the battle turned into a rout.
So in less than an hour, it was over. Around 1,500 Jacobite soldiers were killed or wounded on that field. Just think about that. An entire army and a cause wiped out in 60 minutes. And on the other side, the government army? 50. Just 50 men killed. He just shows you this wasn't a battle. It was a massacre, a brutal and decisive end to the entire uprising.
You'd think the story would end right there, wouldn't you, on that blood-soaked moor? But for centuries, the ground held on to its secrets. And just recently, it started talking again. A new chapter is literally being dug out of the earth.
See, what's so amazing is that the main visitor site we talked about, the part run by the National Trust, is only about a third of the actual battlefield. So archaeologists are now looking beyond the fences into these other areas. And what they're finding, it's just incredible. It gives you chills.
And we're not talking about cannons or swords. We're talking about small, intensely personal items. A single pewter button from a waistcoat, a brass buckle from a horse's harness. And this is amazing. They found a musket ball, perfectly round, that a soldier must have dropped in the panic. And right near it, another one, flattened and mangled from where it hit its target. Each one is a tiny story.
This quote from one of the archaeologists really just hits you, doesn't it? I was holding a musket ball that until today was last touched by a Jacobite warrior. Can you imagine that? Holding something that connects you directly to a person's last moments. It just collapses time and makes it all feel so terribly real.
But the story of Culloden, it doesn't even end with the battle or the archaeology. Because what came after was just as brutal, and in many ways, its impact was even bigger. This was about ensuring the Highland way of life could never threaten the crown again.
Yep, the violence didn't stop when the fighting was over. Far from it. The Duke of Cumberland ordered his men to go back out onto the battlefield and finish off any wounded Highlanders they could find. They hunted them down for weeks, burning and killing. This is how he earned his nickname, the Butcher, Cumberland.
And then came the laws. The government didn't just want to win a battle. They wanted to erase a culture. The Act of Proscription made it illegal to wear tartan, to play the bagpipes, to carry weapons. The whole clan system was dismantled. This directly led to the Highland clearances, where people were forced off their land, starting this mass migration of Scots all over the world. Kind of ironic, isn't it? The very things we think of as iconically Scottish today were once banned.
So how did this field of slaughter become the place of pilgrimage it is today? Well, it took a long time. For more than 100 years, it was just a field. Then, in 1881, the landowner put up the big cairn and the grave markers you see today. Eventually, the National Trust took over, and they've turned it into the international memorial it's become.
And that really brings us back to the present. Why do we still talk about Culloden? Why does it matter so much more than other battles? Well, because for millions of people around the world, in the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, who trace their family history back to Scotland, this isn't just a battlefield. It's a family grave. It's the starting point of their family's story of survival, and it's a powerful, somber reminder of how one single hour can echo for centuries.